Part 1. A Nation in Transition. The year is 1880, and America is standing at the crossroads of history. Imagine the sound of hammers ringing through bustling factories, the whistle of steam engines echoing across vast plains, and the glow of gas lamps lighting crowded city streets. This is not the America of the Revolution, nor is it the sleek modern nation of the 20th century. It is a country caught in between, a place where old traditions collide with the raw energy of rapid change. By the 1880s, the United States had grown into a nation of nearly 50 million people. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia were swelling with new arrivals, while railroads stitched the land together from coast to coast. For many, America symbolized hope and opportunity. Immigrants poured in by the millions, drawn by the promise of jobs, land, and freedom. Yet alongside this promise came struggle. Overcrowded tenements, dangerous factories, and stark divisions between rich and poor. In rural towns, life looked very different. Farmers still rose with the sun, their lives governed by the seasons and the soil. But even here, change was creeping in. Mechanized farming, new rail connections, and national markets were pulling isolated communities into the web of industrial America. A farmer in Kansas might now sell wheat to a mill in St. Louis, or even to markets overseas. This growing interconnection was reshaping the meaning of daily survival. The decade was marked by contrasts. Mansions of gilded wealth stood only blocks away from grimy sweatshops. Politicians boasted of progress, while corruption thrived in smoky backrooms. African Americans in the South faced a brutal backlash as Reconstruction gave way to segregation and violence. Native American tribes were being pushed from their lands in the West, their old ways shattered by relentless expansion. And yet, despite hardship, the 1880s were also a time of remarkable energy and innovation. Inventions like the telephone, the typewriter, and electric lights were beginning to change how people lived and worked. Newspapers carried stories of labor strikes, Wild West outlaws, and larger-than-life millionaires. America was a place of ambition, risk, and reinvention, a nation testing the limits of what it could become. To step into the 1880s is to step into a world that feels both familiar and foreign. The foundations of modern life, urban centers, mass communication, industrial power, were being laid. But so too were the inequalities and conflicts that would define the decades ahead. This was not a golden age free of hardship. It was messy, noisy, and deeply human. So, what was life really like in America in the 1880s? It was a world of sharp contrasts, wealth and poverty, hope and despair, tradition and innovation. It was a time when the American dream glimmered brightly, but only for some, while others struggled in its shadows. To understand it fully, we must step into the lives of those who built, toiled, suffered, and dreamed during one of the most transformative decades in American history. Part 2. Life in the Growing Cities. If the countryside in the 1880s represented tradition and stability, the cities were engines of chaos, opportunity, and transformation. By this decade, America was becoming an urban nation. Millions flocked to New York, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia, drawn by the promise of jobs, excitement, and progress. Yet the reality of city life was far harsher than the glittering skyline of church spires, bridges, and new factories might suggest. Immigrants arrived daily, their ships docking at Ellis Island or Boston Harbor, spilling men, women, and children into the crowded streets. Entire neighborhoods sprang up where languages from across Europe could be heard: Italian in one quarter, Yiddish in another, Irish brogue echoing through the pubs, German across bakeries and beer halls. In these immigrant enclaves, families tried to recreate a sense of home, building churches, schools, and societies, even as they struggled to adapt to a strange new country. Housing was one of the greatest challenges. Tenements, hastily built and poorly maintained, crammed families into dark, airless rooms. In New York's Lower East Side, entire families of 6 or more might live in a single small apartment, sharing outhouses and water pumps with dozens of neighbors. Disease spread quickly in these conditions. Tuberculosis, cholera, and influenza swept through the crowded alleys. For many, survival in the city meant trading comfort for opportunity. Work defined urban life, but it was grueling. Factories roared with the sound of machines, and laborers toiled long hours, 10, 12, even 14 a day, for meager wages. Women worked in garment factories, sewing until their fingers bled, while children carried coal, swept floors, or hawked newspapers on street corners. Industrial accidents were common, and compensation for injury was almost unheard of. Yet, despite the dangers, people endured, for factory wages, however small, were still more than they could earn back in rural villages overseas. Not everyone lived in squalor. The 1880s were also the height of the Gilded Age, when millionaires flaunted their fortunes with dazzling mansions along Fifth Avenue and opulent parties that lasted until dawn. The gap between rich and poor was visible at every turn. A banker's carriage might roll past ragged children begging for pennies, while shop windows glittered with silks and jewels few could ever afford. Mark Twain famously coined the phrase "Gilded Age" to describe this period, where a thin layer of gold masked the deep cracks of poverty and corruption. Public life was equally dynamic. Streetcars and elevated trains carried workers across sprawling cities, while electric lights began to push back the darkness of night. Parks like Central Park in New York offered a rare escape from the grime, while vaudeville theaters, saloons, and dance halls gave the working class moments of respite. Yet even leisure was divided by class. The wealthy attended operas and symphonies, while laborers crowded into smoky music halls. Part 3. The Struggles of Rural America. While the cities of the 1880s buzzed with energy and industry, the majority of Americans still lived in the countryside. Rural life in this decade carried its own set of hardships and rewards, shaped by the rhythms of the seasons and the stubborn realities of the soil. Farmers rose before dawn, worked until sunset, and often faced uncertainty no matter how hard they toiled. Unlike city laborers who endured harsh conditions for low wages, farmers gambled daily against nature itself. The family farm remained the heart of rural America. Fathers, mothers, and children all contributed to the survival of the homestead. Boys helped plow fields, tend livestock, and chop wood, while girls churned butter, sewed clothes, and kept the household running. There was little distinction between work and life. Every hand was needed, and every chore mattered. For many, schooling came second to farm labor, with children attending classes only when fields allowed. Technological advances were beginning to change this world. The steel plow, mechanical reaper, and seed drill allowed farmers to cultivate more land and produce larger harvests. Railroads carried crops to distant markets, connecting small towns in Kansas or Nebraska to buyers in Chicago, or even across the Atlantic. Yet these innovations came with a cost. Machinery was expensive, and many farmers fell into debt, trying to keep up with the pace of progress. Banks charged high interest, and railroads demanded steep shipping fees, leaving farmers squeezed between creditors and corporations. Life was often harsh and lonely. Winters on the Great Plains brought blizzards that trapped families inside sod houses, while summers scorched crops with drought or tore them apart with tornadoes. Locust swarms could descend without warning, stripping fields bare in hours. Medical care was distant, and a simple infection could turn fatal when doctors were miles away over muddy roads. Despite these dangers, families clung to their land with remarkable resilience, bound by hope that next year would be better. Rural communities, though isolated, were tightly knit. Church gatherings, barn dances, and county fairs offered chances for neighbors to come together, share news, and momentarily forget their struggles. These events were lifelines, breaking the monotony of endless work and providing the social glue that held towns together. Newspapers, often delivered by rail, brought national news, but gossip spread faster across church pews or general stores. Not all farmers fared equally. Wealthier landowners expanded their holdings, while tenant farmers and sharecroppers, especially in the South, struggled to escape poverty. African American farmers in the post-Reconstruction South faced not only economic exploitation, but also systemic racism and violence. Many were trapped in cycles of debt peonage, unable to break free from landlords who controlled both the land and the local justice system. Part 4. Waves of Immigration. Few forces shaped the America of the 1880s more than immigration. This decade saw millions of newcomers stepping onto American shores, carrying little more than suitcases and dreams. They came from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Poland, Russia, Scandinavia, and beyond. Others crossed the Pacific from China and Japan. Together, they transformed the character of American cities and towns, creating both opportunity and tension in a rapidly changing nation. The journey itself was often grueling. Families traveled in cramped steerage compartments on steamships, where air was foul and food was meager. Diseases spread easily in the damp, crowded quarters, and seasickness was constant. But for many, the hardships of the voyage were endured with the hope that life in America would bring a better future for their children. Upon arrival, immigrants faced a bewildering world. Processing stations like Castle Garden, before Ellis Island opened in 1892, bustled with officials inspecting passengers, checking documents, and sometimes detaining those deemed unfit. Language barriers and strange customs only heightened the anxiety. For many, stepping onto American soil was both a triumph and a terrifying leap into the unknown. In the cities, immigrants formed tight-knit communities where old traditions survived. Italian neighborhoods buzzed with the aroma of bread and pasta, German quarters filled with beer gardens and singing societies, and Jewish immigrants opened synagogues and kosher shops. These enclaves provided familiarity and safety in a world that was often hostile. They became cultural havens where festivals, religious rituals, and mother tongues softened the edges of dislocation. Work was both opportunity and burden. Immigrants flooded factories, mines, and railroads, taking on the most dangerous and lowest-paying jobs. Irish and Chinese laborers laid tracks across the continent, while Eastern European Jews sweated in garment factories. Scandinavian immigrants headed west to farm the prairies, while Italians dug sewers and laid bricks in expanding cities. The promise of employment was real, but so were the grueling conditions that often left families exhausted and struggling to survive. Prejudice and discrimination shadowed their lives. Established Americans often viewed newcomers with suspicion, accusing them of stealing jobs or bringing crime. Anti-Catholic sentiment targeted Irish and Italian immigrants, while Chinese workers faced violent hostility on the West Coast, culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first significant law to bar a specific ethnic group from entering the United States. Ethnic slurs, restrictive housing, and workplace exploitation reminded immigrants daily that they were outsiders in the land they hoped to call home. Yet despite these challenges, immigrants played a vital role in shaping America. They brought with them languages, foods, music, and traditions that enriched the cultural fabric of the nation. Their labor powered the factories, built the railroads, and filled the cities with energy. Children of immigrants often attended public schools, learned English, and blended into American life, while still carrying the heritage of their parents. This dual identity, old world and new, would come to define much of the American experience. The 1880s were also a decade of hope. Letters sent back across the Atlantic spoke of opportunity, however exaggerated. Relatives encouraged one another to join them, sparking chain migrations that filled neighborhoods with familiar faces. Even when the reality was difficult, the dream endured. For many, America was not just a place of work, but a symbol of freedom, a land where ambition, however constrained, seemed more possible than in the rigid class systems of Europe or the poverty of rural Asia. In the end, the immigrant story of the 1880s was one of contrasts: welcome and hostility, opportunity and exploitation, tradition and assimilation. These waves of newcomers reshaped the United States, fueling its growth while challenging its identity. To walk through an American city in this decade was to hear dozens of languages, smell foods from across oceans, and feel the restless energy of people striving to carve out a place in an often unforgiving new world. Part 5. Industry and Innovation. If immigration provided the hands and hearts of America in the 1880s, industry and innovation supplied the machines and momentum. This decade was the beating heart of the Gilded Age. When smokestacks rose above cities, factories clattered with new machines, and the United States surged forward as an industrial giant. For better and for worse, the country was being transformed by iron, steel, steam, and electricity. Railroads stood at the center of this revolution. By the 1880s, rail lines crisscrossed the nation, linking New England mills with Midwestern farms and carrying settlers, cattle, and goods across the plains to the Pacific. Towns that once seemed isolated now pulsed with new life when the railroad arrived, while those bypassed often withered. The locomotive was not merely a machine, it was a force of destiny, shrinking distance and binding a vast land into a single economy. Industry exploded in the cities. Steel mills in Pittsburgh roared with fire. Textile factories in New England churned out cloth, and Chicago's stockyards processed millions of animals each year. Oil from Pennsylvania and coal from Appalachia fueled this surge, powering factories and warming homes. Industrial titans, Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads, became household names, praised by some as visionaries and condemned by others as robber barons who built empires on the backs of exploited workers. New technologies reshaped daily life. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, patented just a few years earlier, was spreading slowly into businesses and wealthy homes, allowing voices to travel across miles. Thomas Edison's electric light bulb began to push back the night, turning darkness into opportunity for work and leisure. Typewriters clattered in offices, transforming clerical work, and elevators allowed buildings to climb higher into the sky, laying the foundation for the modern city. But industrial progress came at a steep human cost. Factories demanded relentless hours from their workers, often under brutal conditions. Machinery could maim or kill in an instant, and safety regulations were nearly non-existent. Children worked in mines and mills, their small hands ideal for fitting into dangerous spaces. Women worked long shifts in sweatshops, earning only a fraction of men's wages. The promise of industrial prosperity seemed reserved for the owners, not the workers who made it possible. Strikes and labor unrest became common. In 1886, the Haymarket riot in Chicago erupted after a peaceful labor rally turned violent, killing both workers and police. The event shocked the nation, highlighting the growing tension between labor and capital. Workers demanded shorter hours, better pay, and safer conditions, while industrial leaders resisted, fearing any concession would undermine their power. The clash between labor and industry became one of the defining struggles of the era. Yet for all its iniquities, the industrial boom also inspired awe. To walk into a steel mill was to feel the heat of molten iron and witness the raw force of human ingenuity. To ride a train across the plains was to marvel at the speed of modern life. America was building not just factories but a new identity, one defined by ambition, innovation, and the restless drive to conquer both land and technology. The 1880s were a paradox. They produced wealth beyond imagination for a few, and hardship beyond endurance for many. They gave the world marvels of invention and horrors of exploitation. They revealed both the power of human creativity and the dangers of unchecked greed. And in the smoke-filled skies above America's cities, one could glimpse both the glittering promise and the grim reality of industrial progress. It was a time when the future seemed to be rushing forward on wheels of steel and sparks of electricity, and nothing, it seemed, could slow it down. Part 6. Divides of Class and Wealth. The 1880s in America are remembered as the Gilded Age, a term popularized by Mark Twain to describe a society glittering on the surface, yet riddled with cracks beneath. Nowhere was this clearer than in the vast gulf between rich and poor. While industrial magnates dined under chandeliers in palatial mansions, millions of workers struggled just to put bread on the table. At the top stood the elite, families like the Carnegies, Rockefellers, and Vanderbilts, who displayed their fortunes with grand homes along New York's Fifth Avenue and summer estates in Newport. Their parties became legendary, featuring champagne fountains, diamond tiaras, and imported delicacies. Newspapers breathlessly covered these spectacles, portraying the wealthy as icons of success. For these industrialists and financiers, wealth was not only a reward, but proof of superiority, a justification for their dominance in society. Yet only blocks away, the urban poor lived in crowded tenements, where dozens of families shared a single water pump and sanitation was almost non-existent. Children scoured garbage heaps for scraps, mothers worked long hours sewing in sweatshops, and fathers returned home from factories exhausted, their lungs blackened by coal dust. Disease was rampant, and many never lived past 40. For every millionaire who prospered, thousands toiled in obscurity, their struggles hidden from the glittering headlines. The middle class, though smaller than today, was beginning to emerge. Shopkeepers, teachers, clerks, and small business owners lived modestly, but with aspirations. They valued education and respectability, sending their children to school and embracing new technologies like the typewriter and telephone. For them, the 1880s represented a chance to climb the social ladder, even if the climb was steep and uncertain. Philosophies of the time reinforced these divisions. The idea of social Darwinism, promoted by thinkers like Herbert Spencer, argued that wealth and poverty were natural outcomes of survival of the fittest. According to this view, the rich were rich because they were superior, while the poor suffered because of their own failings. This belief justified the lack of government support for workers, widows, or orphans, leaving charity to churches or private benefactors. Still, not all accepted this stark inequality. Reformers, journalists, and labor leaders began to speak out against the excesses of the age. Writers like Henry George, in his book Progress and Poverty, argued that industrial progress had created wealth but also deepened suffering. Settlement houses, such as those later established by Jane Addams, sought to ease the burdens of immigrant communities. Religious movements like the social gospel urged Christians to confront poverty and injustice. Class divide was not only economic, but cultural. The wealthy read different newspapers, attended different theaters, and vacationed in exclusive resorts, while the working poor crowded into vaudeville halls or found escape in saloons. Clothing, too, marked the difference. Silks and tailored suits for the rich, threadbare coats and patched shoes for the laboring class. Even leisure revealed inequality. While the elite enjoyed golf, yachting, and opera, the poor played stickball in alleys or watched traveling circuses when they came to town. Perhaps the starkest symbol of inequality was the workplace itself. Factory owners often never set foot in the mills where their profits were made. Workers saw little chance of advancement, their labor enriching others while offering them only survival. Strikes and protests revealed their anger, but the balance of power remained firmly with the wealthy, who could hire private guards or call in government troops to crush unrest. And yet, despite the divide, the dream of upward mobility persisted. Immigrants saved every penny to educate their children, families scrimped to buy property, and the middle class sought respectability through hard work. The gap between rich and poor was real, but so too was the belief, sometimes illusory, that America offered opportunity if one could endure long enough. The 1880s were an age of dazzling wealth and crushing poverty, of champagne and soot, of hope and despair. They revealed the promise of American ambition and the peril of unchecked greed. And in this tension, the modern story of America, the struggle between equality and excess, was being written. Part 7. Race and Identity in a Divided Nation. Beneath the surface of industrial growth and gilded wealth, the 1880s in America were also defined by deep racial divides and struggles over identity. For African Americans, Native Americans, and other marginalized groups, this was a decade not of progress but of setbacks, violence, and cultural upheaval. The promise of equality born after the Civil War was unraveling, replaced by systems of segregation and oppression that would shape generations to come. For African Americans in the South, the end of Reconstruction brought crushing disappointment. Federal troops had withdrawn, leaving black communities vulnerable to white supremacist groups and discriminatory laws. In many states, new measures systematically stripped African Americans of their right to vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. Segregation hardened into law, dividing schools, trains, and public spaces. Violence, including lynchings, spread terror through black communities. The dream of freedom was still alive, but it was daily assaulted by the harsh realities of racism. Despite these barriers, Black Americans worked tirelessly to build lives of dignity and independence. Churches became centers of community and resistance, offering not just spiritual guidance, but education, social networks, and political leadership. Schools founded by Black educators, often underfunded and attacked, provided a lifeline for children seeking opportunity. Leaders like Frederick Douglass continued to speak out, urging the nation not to abandon its ideals of liberty and equality. Meanwhile, in the West, Native American tribes faced relentless pressure from the expanding United States. By the 1880s, most had been forced onto reservations through broken treaties and military campaigns. The massacre at Wounded Knee was still a decade away, but the seeds of tragedy were already sown. The Dawes Act of 1887 would soon attempt to dismantle tribal lands and assimilate Native people into Euro-American culture, eroding traditions and sovereignty. Boarding schools sought to civilize Native children by stripping them of language, clothing, and cultural identity, often through brutal means. For many tribes, the 1880s marked not just loss of land, but an assault on their very way of life. Chinese immigrants, who had helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, also faced fierce hostility. On the West Coast, resentment boiled over into violence, with riots and expulsions targeting Chinese communities. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 became the first major federal law to bar immigration based on ethnicity, singling out an entire group as unwelcome. Chinese families who had hoped to settle permanently in America suddenly found themselves isolated, scapegoated, and denied the very opportunities they had sacrificed so much to pursue. Other immigrant groups also struggled with identity. Irish, Italian, and Jewish newcomers were often branded as outsiders, their customs mocked, their religions distrusted. Americanization became both a demand and a challenge, as communities tried to preserve old traditions while finding a place in a society that often rejected them. And yet, in the midst of exclusion and prejudice, resilience flourished. African American communities produced vibrant culture, music, and literature that would one day blossom into national movements. Native Americans, though battered, preserved their traditions in secret, passing stories and songs to younger generations. Immigrants built neighborhoods, churches, and businesses that enriched the fabric of American life, even as they fought for acceptance. The 1880s, then, were not simply a decade of invention and industry. They were also a decade of identity struggles, of groups fighting to assert their humanity against systems designed to erase or exploit them. Race, ethnicity, and culture were battlegrounds every bit as important as factories and railroads. To understand this decade fully, one must see both sides, the rising towers of progress and the shadows they cast over those denied its benefits. For millions of Americans in the 1880s, the struggle was not only for survival, but for recognition, dignity, and a rightful place in the nation's story. Part 8. Politics and Labor Unrest. If the 1880s were an age of booming industry and restless ambition, They were equally an age of political turbulence and labor unrest. The rapid growth of factories, railroads, and cities created tensions that neither politicians nor workers could ignore. Corruption spread through government halls, while workers filled the streets with protests, strikes, and sometimes violence. This decade tested the very stability of American democracy. Politics during the Gilded Age was notorious for corruption. Party machines controlled city governments, trading jobs and favors for votes. In New York, Tammany Hall remained the symbol of political patronage, handing out contracts and positions in exchange for loyalty. At the national level, presidents from Rutherford B. Hayes to Chester A. Arthur presided over administrations often remembered less for vision than for scandals and factional disputes. Politicians rarely challenged the dominance of business interests, and corporations poured money into campaigns to ensure friendly laws. One of the most visible issues was civil service reform. Government jobs had long been handed out as rewards to loyal supporters, a practice known as the spoils system. But after the shocking assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 by a disgruntled office seeker, the nation demanded change. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883 marked a turning point, introducing merit-based exams for certain government positions. Though limited, it signaled the beginning of a shift toward more professional governance. Yet while reform chipped away at corruption, labor unrest threatened to shake the foundations of industrial America. Workers, exhausted by long hours and meager wages, began to organize. Labor unions grew in strength, with groups like the Knights of Labor calling for shorter workdays, better pay, and safer conditions. Their demands resonated with millions of workers who felt trapped in dangerous jobs, while industrial tycoons amassed fortunes. The tension erupted in strikes that often turned violent. In 1886, Chicago became the epicenter of labor struggle with the Haymarket Affair. What began as a peaceful rally for the 8-hour workday ended in bloodshed when a bomb exploded among police, killing several officers and civilians. The event shocked the nation, fueling fears of anarchism and radicalism, while also highlighting the desperate plight of workers. For many Americans, the Haymarket tragedy symbolized both the dangers of unrest and the urgency of reform. Railroad strikes were also frequent, reflecting the central role trains played in the economy. Workers protested wage cuts, unsafe conditions, and the power of railroad barons who seemed untouchable. The strikes often paralyzed entire regions, drawing in federal troops to restore order. The government's readiness to side with business interests deepened workers' sense of betrayal, convincing many that the political system served the wealthy rather than the common man. Amid the turmoil, voices of reform grew louder. Journalists exposed the excesses of monopolies, preachers denounced greed, and farmers' organizations like the Grange joined industrial workers in calling for fairer treatment. Out of these struggles emerged new political movements that would shape the decades ahead, including the populists and eventually the progressives. The 1880s were, in many ways, a proving ground. Could a democratic nation survive the pressures of industrial capitalism, massive inequality, and waves of discontent? The decade did not resolve the question, but it revealed both the resilience of American workers and the fragility of the institutions meant to represent them. Behind the parades and patriotic speeches, the reality was clear. America's prosperity rested on a foundation of unrest. Strikes, protests, and political battles defined the decade as much as railroads and factories did. And in the struggle between labor and capital, the seeds of modern reform and modern conflict were sown. Part 9. Culture and Entertainment. Amid the struggles of labor, politics, and survival, the 1880s in America were also alive with culture and entertainment. Even in the harshest conditions, people sought laughter, music, and diversion from the burdens of daily life. This was the decade when vaudeville theaters flourished, Wild West shows captivated audiences, and professional sports began to take shape. Culture in the 1880s was as much a mirror of society as it was an escape from it. Vaudeville was the entertainment of the masses. For just a few cents, audiences crowded into theaters to watch a dazzling mix of comedy acts, jugglers, singers, magicians, dancers, and animal performances. Unlike the highbrow operas and symphonies favored by the wealthy, vaudeville offered something for everyone, from factory workers to immigrant families. Its variety and humor created a uniquely American form of popular entertainment, one that would eventually give birth to Hollywood and television. For those craving spectacle, Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show became a sensation. Beginning in the 1880s, it toured the nation and even Europe, presenting a romanticized version of frontier life. Cowboys, Native Americans, trick riders, and sharpshooters like Annie Oakley thrilled crowds with reenactments of battles and daring feats. Though often steeped in stereotype, these shows captured the imagination of audiences and helped create the enduring myth of the American West, a land of rugged heroes and untamed freedom. Sports, too, began to capture national attention. Baseball, already popular since the Civil War, emerged in the 1880s as the nation's pastime. Teams like the Chicago White Stockings and the New York Giants filled stadiums with cheering fans. Football was taking root on college campuses, while boxing bouts drew large crowds, despite being controversial. Sports offered not only entertainment, but a sense of community and identity, uniting cities and regions in loyalty to their teams. Literature and the arts reflected the complexity of the age. Writers like Mark Twain used sharp wit to satirize the greed and corruption of the Gilded Age, while poets and novelists explored themes of industrialization, poverty, and social change. Newspapers expanded rapidly, carrying serialized stories, political cartoons, and sensational headlines that reached millions. For many, the newspaper was both education and escape, shaping how Americans saw their world. Music flowed through every corner of society. Immigrant neighborhoods filled the air with old country songs, while African-American spirituals and folk traditions laid the foundation for future musical revolutions. Parlors in middle-class homes echoed with piano melodies, while saloons reverberated with fiddles and banjos. Music connected communities, carrying stories and emotions that transcended language barriers. Amusements were often simple, but deeply valued. Families visited fairs, rode carousels, and marveled at new inventions displayed at exhibitions. Coney Island in New York began to attract visitors with its beaches and entertainment, offering a preview of the amusement parks that would define the next century. Even in rural areas, barn dances, church socials, and traveling circuses brought moments of joy. For the wealthy, culture meant something different. They attended operas, art galleries, and lectures, viewing refinement as both entertainment and a marker of status. Patronage of the arts grew, with industrial millionaires funding museums and concert halls as symbols of both civic pride and personal prestige. This divide between elite and popular culture mirrored the class divisions of the time, but both spheres revealed a nation hungry for expression and distraction. The cultural energy of the 1880s showed that America was not only an industrial powerhouse, but a nation of storytellers, performers, and dreamers. Entertainment helped people endure hardship, while also shaping a shared national identity. From vaudeville stages to baseball diamonds, from Wild West arenas to crowded newspaper stands, culture in the 1880s was vibrant, diverse, and deeply human. It was a reminder that even in a decade marked by struggle, people still laughed, sang, cheered, and dreamed. And in those moments of joy and escape, America found a way to hold itself together. Part 10. Legacy of the 1880s. Looking back, the 1880s were more than just a decade wedged between the Civil War and the dawn of the 20th century. They were a turning point, a time when the United States began to shed its image as a young frontier nation and step onto the stage as an industrial power. The legacies of this era, its triumphs, contradictions, and struggles, continue to shape America even today. The most obvious legacy was industrial growth. By the end of the 1880s, America had become a global leader in steel, oil, and manufacturing. The railroads stitched the country together, binding distant regions into one national market. Innovations like the electric light bulb, the telephone, and mechanized farming equipment laid the foundations of the modern world. The very infrastructure of the 20th century was being built in these years of smoke and steel. But progress came with deep scars. The decades cemented the divide between rich and poor, a pattern that would fuel reform movements in the years to come. The opulence of the Gilded Age elite was dazzling, but it also provoked outrage, giving birth to labor unions, social reformers, and political challengers who demanded fairness in an age of greed. The clashes of the 1880s foreshadowed the great battles of the Progressive Era and beyond. The struggles of marginalized groups also left enduring marks. For African Americans, the 1880s represented the entrenchment of segregation and disenfranchisement, policies and attitudes that would take nearly a century to overturn. For Native Americans, the decade brought dispossession and cultural assault, consequences that echo through communities even today. The Chinese Exclusion Act marked a shameful milestone in immigration history, setting precedents for restrictive policies that would last generations. These injustices are part of the legacy too, reminding us that progress was not shared equally. Culturally, the 1880s gave America a new sense of identity. The rise of vaudeville, Wild West shows, and baseball created forms of entertainment that still resonate in modern popular culture. Writers, musicians, and performers of the era captured both the humor and hardship of their times, giving voice to a nation wrestling with change. The myths of the cowboy, the spectacle of mass entertainment, and the obsession with celebrity all trace roots to this decade. Politically, the reforms sparked in the 1880s, like the Pendleton Civil Service Act, were small but important steps toward cleaning corruption and professionalizing government. They reflected a growing recognition that democracy could not survive unchecked patronage and corporate power. Though fragile, these seeds of reform laid the groundwork for the stronger reforms of the Progressive Era.